10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, episode 278. Hey everybody, welcome back to episode 278 of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. As always, we're so glad to have you back for another episode. This week we are continuing our series on pentatonics. Last week we talked about pentatonic options over a minor 7 chord. This week we're going to talk about the dominant chord and get a little bit deeper into this stuff. But as always, before we jump into the episode, just wanted to remind you that this is a listener-supported show, which means we do not have any advertisements on the podcast, and we depend on listeners just like you to make a small monthly donation in return for all of the materials that I present to you on this show. And that is how we stay alive and keep the show coming at you in high quality week in and week out. Now, the way that you can support us is on a platform called Patreon. And if you want to learn more about what it costs each month to be a supporter and what you get in return, you can go to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners. It'll bring you over there, explain all that stuff to you, and allow you to get signed up for instant access to all 278 episodes that we have ever put out on the show. Wanted to give a quick shout out to our new $5 patron this week. Thank you to RC. Really appreciate you joining the family, and to the over 350 members that we have over there. Thank you. You are the reason that this show has lasted for this long and keeps coming at you. So again, 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, get yourself signed up for instant access today. All right, so let's jump into this week's material. As I mentioned, last week we talked about some pentatonic options over a minor chord. This week, we're going to continue with the dominant 7th chord, and we're going to talk about some of the options we have. This week's going to be a little bit different. Last week, when we talked about those pentatonics, those major pentatonics over a minor chord, we were staying completely diatonic, which meant that every single note that we played, every single pentatonic that we investigated, stayed within the notes of that scale, of the Dorian scale. This week, we're kind of forced to go outside of the diatonic world. But of course, that works really well over dominant chords. Because when we think about a dominant chord, typically what we're thinking about is a 5 chord, usually moving to a 1 chord. And we know that in that scenario, we've talked about so many times on the podcast, we want to introduce some tension, so that we can get the tension and release sound. And even when that dominant chord is not functioning as a 5 chord, it still is a really, really great tonality to introduce tension to. The dominant chord just works really well when it comes to playing a little bit outside of the key or trying to use some more interesting sounds, right? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. You're going to see we're going to go way outside of that diatonic model. But let's dive into the first example that we have on the worksheet this week. So we are going to be working with a concert F7 chord, and that is the tonality we're going to use to investigate these different pentatonic scales as we go through. Okay, so the first one we are going to investigate is actually diatonic, and it's just playing a major pentatonic off of the root of that chord. Now, we know that this is going to work really well because we've got some great notes. If we play 1, 2, 3, 5, 6 over a dominant chord, all of those notes are going to sound fantastic. Now, we aren't using any of the avoid notes. Remember, the 4th isn't an avoid note, but the nice thing about the major pentatonic is that it completely disregards that note, so we don't even have a danger of playing that 4th and playing one of those undesirable notes. And of course, the 1, the 2, the 3, the 5, and the 6 work beautifully over that chord. Now, the reason why we can't use any other diatonic major pentatonic scales over a dominant chord is that they all touch on 2 avoid notes, which would be the 4th or the major 7th. So go ahead and think about in your head starting a major pentatonic off of each note in the Mixolydian scale and realize that we're going to hit one of those undesirable notes. So that's kind of stopping us from investigating further diatonic stuff. So we really have no choice but to go outside of the key and hit on some of those key tensions that sound really, really good over a dominant chord by using completely unrelated scales, but really thinking this stuff through. So the first one that we're going to use is actually a tritone substitution of the major pentatonic scale. So over an F dominant 7th chord, we're going to use a B major pentatonic, and it's going to be really, really tense. There's going to be a lot of great notes in this, and this would be a perfect thing to use over like F7 altered, because we want all those altered tones. Here's what it sounds like. So you can hear that's very, very tension-filled. Let's talk about what those notes are over F7. So we start on a B, which is the sharp 11. Then we go to a C sharp, which is the sharp 5. Then we go to a D sharp / E flat, which is the 7th. Then we go to an F sharp or an A flat, which is the flat 9. And then we finally go to a G sharp / A flat, which is the sharp 9. So it actually does a really wonderful job of fitting into that altered sound. So unfortunately, this is kind of the only one that we can use, because even if we go outside of the key and we investigate all the major pentatonics starting on all 12 notes over a dominant 7th chord, we're going to get a bunch of those avoid notes. Now, there are situations where you can totally use things that have the avoid notes if you know how to do it, but we're not going to talk about those right now. We're just going to talk about pentatonic scales where everything just works, okay? So now let's talk about how you can actually use this in a couple of different situations. So the first situation would be if you have like a 2-5-1, you could just play that tritone substitution pentatonic scale over the entire measure, and it's going to give you a ton of tension, and then you release it when you hit the 1 chord, right? That tension and release model that we talk about almost every episode of this podcast. We're talking about that tension and release model. Now, what if you had an extended dominant chord where it just stayed on that F7 chord for a couple of measures? In that case, you could go back and forth in between the pentatonic that starts on the root and the one that starts on the tritone. And that can provide you with a really, really cool way of coming up with new material when the chord is kind of static. All right, so that's what I'd like to talk about here at the end. I'm going to play a little demonstration for you where I'm kind of freely switching back and forth between an F concert pentatonic and a B major pentatonic, the one based off of the tritone. And what you'll hear is it creates this really cool effect of kind of going inside and outside of the actual harmony. And this is what you hear a lot of your favorite musicians doing, is balancing that tension and release. So this is a backing track of just a concert F7 chord, just over and over and over again. And I'm going to take a very specific approach to this. So I'm going to play in 4-bar phrases. For the first 3 bars, I'm going to use that root diatonic pentatonic scale. And then over the 4th bar, I'm going to go out and play that one based off of the tritone. And then when the new phrase starts, I'm going to resolve back to that root pentatonic. So it is definitely structured, and I'm placing that tension right at the end of the phrase and then releasing it at the beginning of the next phrase. So really listen for those 4-bar phrases as I go through this. Let's check this out. Okay, so you can very clearly hear that tension in that last bar of the 4-bar phrase. You can also very clearly hear when I am resolving that tension. And that's what you're going to have to work on. You're going to have to work on two things. First of all, you're going to have to get really, really fluent with that concert B major pentatonic so that you can use it freely and you can use it without any hesitation. And then the second thing you're going to have to work on is resolving that tension on the downbeat of the next phrase. So those two things will be really important. I want to do one more playing example. This time I'm going to do 2 measures in and 2 measures out. So the first 2 measures will be using the root pentatonic, and the second 2 measures will be using that tritone pentatonic. So this is just leaning on that tension a little bit more. It's giving you a little bit more time under tension, and you'll hear that it's a completely different sound. So this is 2 and 2, still playing in the 4-bar phrases, and always resolving back to that root pentatonic on the first measure of the next phrase. So you can hear it's a little bit clinical sounding because it is just me practicing after all, but it's a great way to get used to switching back and forth between those two. And you could hear that the tension is a lot more pronounced in that second example because I'm just spreading it out over 2 bars rather than 1. So try both of those things and see if you can start getting a little bit of dexterity doing that kind of stuff. That would be a really fantastic way to go about this, getting these sounds into your playing. So if you have any questions, please leave them for me in the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Community Facebook group, or you can always get in touch with me at 10minutejazzlesson@gmail.com. Remember to get signed up for the Patreon so you get all of these materials, including everything that we've ever done on the show. You can do that by going to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, clicking on one of the Patreon banners, getting yourself signed up for instant access. Hope you're all doing well out there, staying safe and healthy as always, and we will see you next week with a brand new episode. Have a good one, everybody. Bye.